I think it might be a good exercise for you, or at least over the weekend when you have nothing much else to do, to get a small outline map of about the same size of the United States and simply sketch out the distributions given here of the species that you are particularly interested in, Californica, Berlandieri, and so on. I think in general it will show you that most of the North American species are concentrated in the southeast, as if the origin were toward the more tropical areas, say of Florida, and then moved upward, or at least had been contracted maybe down to that area. You'll find that there are many, many species in the southeast, and then the number becomes less and less as you go westward and as you go northward. Now, this is a fairly complete species list of the North American ones, except that Bailey, who made this classification, did all of his botanizing north of the Mexican border. And we have found since that there are quite a few other wild grapes south of the U.S. border. So really North America is not completely represented yet, as we see here. This is the North American groupings as made by Bailey around 1937. Now, I think you should, for example, count these up, see how many species we have in North America. Note also that in the Caribbean area and south into South America, you only have the single type, the single species, indica, which goes into the northern part of the Amazon basin. It occupies the islands also of the Caribbean, Haiti, Santo Domingo. Through there, have a lot of this Vitis indica, the tropical species. You saw it in the vineyard yesterday, the first section. The other section will see it today. Now, the Asiatic species, not too well known. As a correction again, under Vitis, the second species down under the Asiatic group is Flexuosa, F-L-E-X, F-L-E-X-U-O-S-A, Flexuosa. I think the rest seem to be correctly spelled. Now, you'll notice under Asiatic species there are quite a group, but in general this group has not provided much for viticulture because they do not contain resistance to many of our important diseases and insects, such as Phylloxera and so on. However, one species has been used a great deal by the Russian grape breeders, the amurensis, Vitis amurensis, which is the most northern growing grape species in the Asiatic group. And this has been used to incorporate cold resistance, winter cold resistance, into the vinifera grape. They have used this then to hybridize with vinifera to get more cold-resistant varieties. Amurensis. Amurensis. So really that's the only one that's been made use of so far by viticulturists. And then we place the Muscadini in a separate genus, although some might still want to call it as part of the Vitis group. And in here we have the three species, of which the one that you are responsible for and should know something about is rotundifolia, or the muscadine grape of the southeastern states.
Dr. Olmo?
Yes.
I've read that there's a viticulture that's starting in People's Republic. Is that based on the Asiatic species or in China?
No, in Russia they grow a lot of vinifera grapes, but in many of the areas, in the continental areas, they have to, the winter cold is so severe that they have to cover the vine, or at least plant it so that it's protected by snow. So the vinifera vine is not really very tolerant to low winter temperature. So the amurensis goes down to about minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit without injuring the buds of the plant.
But in the South Amur River is in the northern part of China. What about in the southern part of China where they do grow grapes? Is that their native species or?
No, they grow some vinifera in China, but I'm not familiar personally with the Chinese groups of grapes. They do grow vinifera, that's all I know, but I haven't seen how extensively or what their varieties are.
Do these species produce good fruit, or?
The Chinese types? Yes. They are vinifera types, probably introduced from the Middle Asian area.
I mean the Asiatic species themselves.
Oh, Amarensis produces, it looks somewhat like our Riparia. It has a very small berry, but not a bad flavor, a neutral flavor, so it's quite useful. Gives a reasonably good hybrid as far as wine quality is concerned. So the Russians are making quite extensive use of this species.
Is Vitis robusca considered to be a species, or how is that fit in?
Vitis labrusca should be included here, but it's missed, is it? LA, it should be, you should put it down after L-I, after your I, L-A-B-R-U-S-C-A. Put in Vitis labrusca, which is often called the fox grape. And that's the northeastern U.S. New York, Maine, Massachusetts, all through the northeastern states you find the labrusca. Now many of these American varieties we spoke about, Concord for example, or Catawba, are sometimes listed as Vitis labrusca, which they are not. They are hybrids between labrusca and vinifera. And sometimes a special name is used for those, a species name, but I prefer not to use a species name for a hybrid. Sometimes you see the word labruscana for these American varieties having labrusca in them. But I think we should get away from that notion. Now, thank you for calling that omission to my attention there. That should have been in. I don't know how it was left out. Maybe in cutting out labruscana, we also omitted labrusca. Now, any other comments on the species groupings here? And we have now gone over the ones that you will be responsible for in more detail. I would suggest that you do a little bit more, that you get this outline map and map some of the distributions just for your own information and interest. Now, the vinifera grape is found, of course, in the wild. It sometimes takes another name simply because botanists felt the need to separate the wild from the cultivated, but this is not a very adequate type of separation. So you will see for the wild type sometimes Vitis sylvestris or Vitis vinifera sylvestris, indicating the native or wild form. Now, the vinifera grape is still to be found in its native state in Middle Asia, northern Iran, in Afghanistan. Also, remnants of this species are found in Yugoslavia, in the Rhine Valley of Germany, presumably in Spain, but this is questionable. Also questionable in North Africa. But at least it goes into the Danube and the Rhine basins for sure. So at least at one time, perhaps this vinifera was widely distributed. Now it's rather limited mostly to the Middle Asian area with outlying populations that can be found in these countries that I mentioned. However, the relationship of this present wild vinifera to cultivated varieties is not very clearly established. The indications are that most of the cultivated varieties came out of the Middle Asian area and then were carried westward and eastward from there. So whether the existence of the wild vinifera grape, for example, in Yugoslavia really means anything as far as those cultivated varieties are concerned is open to doubt. There is a theory, for example, that the Riesling, since it is found widely in Germany. It's by far their most important variety. That this variety simply is a descendant of the wild grape found in the Rhine Valley. Just a few weeks ago, I saw some of these wild grapes in the Rhine area, below Frankfurt. And however, they don't, at least the present ones, don't resemble the Riesling very much. However, maybe long, long ago, there were some seedlings from the wild grape. But this is a questionable type of evidence. So far, all we can say is that the relationship between the present wild grapes in Europe, for example, the wild vinifera, and the cultivated varieties there is questionable. In other words, it might be that the wild vinifera was there, but other varieties apparently were brought in from Middle Asia. There is a certain amount of evidence that this is true, that these varieties migrated or were carried along. For example, you find in some countries the same variety under different names. For example, Palomino is not only found in Spain, where it's known best, so you might say, well, it originated in southern Spain in the Sherry area, where you find it grown almost exclusively. However, if you go over to North Africa, you find another variety with another name that does not look any different from the Palomino under an entirely different name. And then if you go further eastward into Israel and into some of the Arab countries, you find still other types that are certainly very, very closely related to Palomino. So it would appear, at least from the evidence, that these varieties have originated in Middle Asia and more or less perhaps have changed somewhat by crossing after they were taken to new viticultural areas. Now, so much for the species, and we will give you some more handout sheets on the field trips on Thursday and Friday. Now, for the second section, I wish to announce that the field trip to the Napa Valley will be held on Friday afternoon. We will like to leave here promptly at 1 o'clock and be back at 6 o'clock. 1 o'clock and be back at 6. So you'll have to provide for your quick lunch and be ready to go. We will meet, if some of you happen to live in the Napa Valley or drive your own car, we will meet first at the Mondavi Winery, the Robert Mondavi Winery, at about 2:20 to 2:30. 2:20 to 2:30. So at least if you meet us there, you will go along with the tour. And then after that, depending on how much time we have left, we will visit the experimental station at Oakville and also tour a couple of the vineyards if time permits. Now, we want to get over to the subject of Phylloxera. And since this is a very interesting and important insect.
Just before you get into that, can I ask a question?
Yes?
In the lab, Wade gave us about 11 red, 11 white varietal.
Table grapes?
No, varietal.
Varietal wine grapes?
Right, that we should probably know some more characteristics of.
Right.
And is there any more limited list of the table grapes? While
You'd like to limit it down perhaps to 1 or 2? Yeah. Well, we will do that. We will probably limit the number of table grapes as well. Although most of you knew the table grapes pretty well. It's quite easy to tell a seedless from a seeded grape, isn't it? Okay, we'll give you a limited list on Thursday and Friday when we make the field trips. I'll make a note of that. Now, I must say also that the midterm is going to be a week from today, and it will cover a wide range of material, everything you've had since the beginning until I leave. So it will give you a very wide choice from the standpoint of the material covered. It will have things like this. We will give a whole list of varieties and make some statements about these varieties and expect you to take the variety name and fill it in where it applies. Something of this nature, but you'll have a great many questions to answer. So it should test your skills pretty thoroughly.
1 hour test.
Dr. Nelson's got it.
If it's agreeable with you, it will not include the 2 lectures that I've given.
Dr. Nelson wants to keep aside his material, so we will not put in any questions on Dr. Nelson's 2 lectures.
Will it include the lab period with Dr. Goheen?
It will include the lab period with Dr. Goheen. I hope you don't ask next, will it include the lectures that Olmo has given? Now let's get to Phylloxera. We find 2 different scientific names now used for Phylloxera. The one most commonly used until a few years ago was Phylloxera vastatrix. The present one now is, it's got a tongue twisting DAC, Phylloxera. I don't think they've improved any. What happened is that they found that an earlier author had used this name, so they give the earlier author precedence. But in general terms, we still say Phylloxera. Phylloxera. But you should recognize this name, given originally by Schiemer. And this one, I believe, was Planchon, the French. Now, this insect produced a crisis unparalleled in the history of European viticulture. The first damage to vines was noted in 1868 near Bordeaux, and about the same time in the southern part of the country in the Provence area. That's Provence. 25 years later, over half of the 6,250,000 acres in French vineyards had been invaded. 6,250,000 acres of vineyard, over half of that had been invaded after 25 years of this original discovery. By 1923, all of the French districts were phylloxerated. When we say phylloxerated, that simply means that Phylloxera infestation had occurred. The insect has spread to practically all the viticultural regions of the world. There are some exceptions where countries are still free of this pest. One place is the island of Cyprus that sets out in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. It's therefore pretty well isolated by water. This may be one factor why Phylloxera hasn't appeared in those vineyards as yet. There are other areas in Middle Asia. Iran, Afghanistan, and India have no reports of Phylloxera infesting their vineyards. And then the northern vineyards of Germany, particularly in the Rhine and the Moselle valleys, are usually free of Phylloxera, although some regions are suspect. But no problem from the dying of vines due to Phylloxera infestation have occurred in those areas. Then we skip over to South America. The only country in South America remaining free of Phylloxera is Chile, and they have a rather large viticultural industry. No Phylloxera has been found in Chilean vineyards. In still other areas, such as Argentina and California, the spread of the insect after introduction has been quite slow. Apparently in the virgin and the deep soils, it may take decades to kill a vine, even after it is infected. However, one thing is certain from past experience, that any soil or vineyard that contains Phylloxera and is then replanted, that it is certain the new planting cannot survive on its own roots. You then have to turn to the use of resistant rootstocks. Now, most of you are aware that the use of a resistant rootstock adds to the cost and the difficulties of establishing a vineyard. First of all, you are using 2 plants instead of one for furnishing the root system, the other to furnish the fruiting variety. So the complications are, first of all, the question of handling 2 varieties or systems instead of one. The grafting procedure is expensive and takes time. And thirdly, the opportunity of introducing virus or other diseases through the grafting union. Now, what are the symptoms by which we recognize Phylloxera attack? Well, actually, it's one of the easiest maladies, really, to recognize once you have seen it in a vineyard or once you have seen a vineyard killed out with Phylloxera. First of all, there's a gradual weakening of the vine, just a gradual overall weakening of the vine. The annual shoot growth becomes less and less year by year until the vine finally dies. And the trunk is left standing there with its arms and no new growth whatever comes from it. These affected vines then, the area involved becomes larger and larger with time, so that in the central area we may have dead vines, and instead of putting an X on the dead vines now, we're going to put a very white blot on them. But say our vineyard vines are spaced more or less like this. The picture one gets then is this, that a vine, for example, will die here, and then this spot keeps spreading outward, more or less concentrically. And another strange thing about Phylloxera is that it's very seldom that you'll only see one spot developing in the vineyard, but at the same time, in other sections of a healthy, otherwise healthy vineyard, you may see another spot starting up, which may be quite far removed from this one. In other words, it usually means then that when you see this sort of condition, perhaps all of the vines already have some of the bugs, and that in some of the areas they're developing at a much more rapid rate than in others. Now, this type of condition is often referred to as an oil spot appearance. In other words, the area begins enlarging much like an oil spot on water. It begins to enlarge its periphery continuously. And these vines outside here will show weakening effects, so they'll be much smaller in growth than the ones farther removed. So you see this gradation from the center area outward. So the oil spot explanation more or less describes the situation pretty well. A focus, and then this focus expanding to include other vines around it. Now, there are no symptoms on the leaves or on the trunks or on the branches, no symptoms above ground, except simply a lessened growth until the vine gets so weak that it dies. Now, as far as the root system is concerned, the damage is really twofold. We have first the young or tender root tips on the fibrous root system, which develops from the main roots. And these are much branched rootlets, which end up with a growing point of a young root, which is usually light greenish or whitish in color. It's actively growing, and it, of course, represents the chief absorbing area for the whole vine, both for water and for nutrient materials. So this is the active part of the growing root system. Obviously, then, this could only be attacked in the springtime or summer when the root system is active, when the temperature of the soil perhaps reaches above 50 degrees Fahrenheit or thereabouts. So then when these young roots develop, the Phylloxera immediately seek them out, the adults that can crawl around through these spaces in the soil, and they then will attach themselves to these young root tips, and usually it'll be a short distance in back of the actual growing point. So a Phylloxera will sit right in this position. He puts his mouth parts or sucking mechanism into the root and gets his nutrient in that way. In this case, we should say not he, but she, because all of the gall forms below ground are she's. And they reproduce by laying innumerable eggs parthenogenetically. In other words, there's no mating, no males present, so the eggs are produced in great numbers. Now, what happens here is soon after this Phylloxera attaches itself to this young root, the root tip then begins to turn suddenly, and the growth is stimulated not here but above. In other words, this portion of the root is partially killed or stopped, and most of the growth then takes place on the upper side so that the root turns over, and we get then what we call a typical bird's beak effect. So then this root is essentially, the Phylloxera would be right in here then. This root then is effectively stopped in its elongation and in its growth due to the attack of just one single insect. So this, you can see, is damaging. If there were many Phylloxera, obviously practically every root tip might be attacked. If that's the case, then the vine is pretty thoroughly throttled as far as the intake of water and nutrients is concerned. That usually does not happen. It's very seldom that you see many root tips attacked, but in some cases you may see quite a number. Trouble here again. Did you get that or did I mess it up? I dropped this off somewhere. At the beginning. I'm not going to repeat.
Below the root hair zone?
Yes, right below the root hair zone. Now, on the older roots, the females also attach themselves. In other words, on a root of this size, or maybe even of this size, a larger root, but there the action is quite different, because as the female attaches itself, it creates a swelling, more or less, from the attack around it. A swelling or a wart-like growth of the root takes place. And this is very spongy tissue. It's very easily invaded by other organisms, by mold and small insects, so that the tissue, after its outgrowth, soon decays and furrows are formed, and a rather deep lesion will occur with the additional growth of the root. So as the section yesterday saw, a larger root attacked by Phylloxera has deep furrows instead of being a smooth outer tissue, presenting smooth outer tissue. You have these furrows which are blackened as much of the bark is decayed. And then if you remove the outer bark on these roots, you will find that the Phylloxera is usually in under the outer bark on the living tissue where it can insert mouth parts and get the necessary sustenance. Now, one of the characteristics about Phylloxera as they attack these roots is that usually colonies are formed. The insect in that sense is gregarious. They like to keep together in bands. And yesterday's class saw good examples of this. If you see Phylloxera, usually you see a mass of them in given portions of the root. Perhaps the living conditions for them there are a little better. And usually when you see them, you see all stages of the Phylloxera in development, the little oval-shaped, yellow-colored eggs, up to the adult, which is fairly large, with the abdomen and thorax and the little leg. So when you see the Phylloxera, then you'll see the different stages in between the egg and the adult. Now, so due to the combined effect of these root tips being invaded, we call these nodosities when the root tips make these little bends or bird beak affair things are called nodosity, that type of injury. This type of injury where you get the swelling of the root like a wart due to the attack of the insect below, we call a tuberosity. Tuberosity. I wrote it on here for you. Now, the most damaging effects of the Phylloxera are due to tuberosities because the insect keeps multiplying very rapidly, extending its location so that rather deep wounds are formed in these roots as they grow. And along with the decay then, the root system soon ceases to function very well and eventually dies. Now we'll briefly go through the life cycle of the insect and point out to you that the life cycle as we know it, say here in California, is very different from the natural cycle that occurs on the American vines, which we might say are resistant. In other words, the American vine is usually resistant simply because we have a condition whereby the insect lives in company with the grapevine. And the insect gets what it wants, and the grapevine gets what it wants, and they both live happily ever after. So just because you say a vine is resistant to Phylloxera, it usually doesn't mean that the insect does not live in the vine. It's usually the contrary, that the insect can complete its cycle on the American vine, but it does not kill the vine. Otherwise, of course, the insect would be finished itself, would it not? Now, another strange thing about Phylloxera is that there is no alternate host of any kind. In other words, Phylloxera cannot live on an oak tree or on a mustard plant or on a banana palm. It lives only on grapevines, only on grapevines. So obviously, its dissemination must start somewhere from an infected grapevine. Now, the cycle starts with the laying of a single winter egg by a female that looks like a small white fly, a very minute fly. You can just barely see them. They're very delicate creatures. If you blow at one in a Petri dish, you'll probably land over the other side of the room. They're very, very delicate insects, very small, just a millimeter or a little more in length. They look like these regular white flies that you see in greenhouses sometimes on plants, but these are much larger. But they look like a miniature of that. Hence, they're extremely light, so they can be blown by the wind many, many miles. They could probably be found in the air currents. And, of course, they would obviously distribute the insect over great distances. Now, these winged males and females mate. After they come up from the soil, they mate. And the female produces only one egg, a single egg from each female. This female will land on the vine in the late fall, usually in October, September, and it oviposits a single egg, and this egg is usually laid under the bark, very often from a 2 or 3 year old trunk or stem, where the bark is well separated so the female can alight and get in under the protection of the bark, and it lays this single egg here, which gives rise to the next propagation. This is called the winter egg, or sometimes we might call it the founder. From these then in the spring, when the vine begins to grow, about the end of March or April, this egg hatches out, produces a larva, which crawls upward toward the shoots that are just beginning to come out. This larva then reaches a young unfolding leaf and again puts in its mouth parts, and this stimulation causes, not on the upper side of the young leaf, but on the lower side, a sac-like growth or a gall. So the insect is actually inside of this gall. Once this gall is formed, the insect keeps reproducing, laying eggs, and new individuals are produced. Now, it is interesting that such a formation of galls does not ordinarily take place on the vinifera grape, but it does take place abundantly on some of the American species. Riparia, for example, I have seen Riparia in the field so badly galled that the leaf does not expand at all, just simply covered with these galls. And then from this first insect infestation, then we have something in the way of 4 or 5 generations that occur. And these insects then from the gall, when they mature, then come outward and start again to move upward toward the younger leaves, and they then infect those. So new galls are formed as the shoot grows. The galls may not be totally confined to the leaves. Sometimes they're even formed in the young stem, or they may be formed in the tendrils, even on the flower clusters. Now these adults here lay about 35 eggs per day. So you see they reproduce pretty fast. And usually there are about 4 molts. In other words, the insect, as it matures or grows from the egg, molts 4 times before it becomes an adult, which takes perhaps a couple weeks. So these are produced in great numbers, and there are perhaps around 4 to 5 generations that may occur, so they can keep moving up onto the shoot. Now, toward fall or late summer, in August or September, some of these may then start wandering downward toward the root system, either on the trunk, or they may sometimes simply drop to the ground. And of course, a good source of infection is in the fall when these basal leaves drop. They obviously could release a lot of these phylloxera right on the top of the soil. Then these forms go to the root system and seek out the roots and establish themselves there. So really the leaf form is equivalent to a root form from that standpoint. Then the phylloxera establish themselves, like I told you, more or less in colonies. They reproduce here. But these are, again, females that reproduce parthenogenetically. They simply lay eggs, establish these colonies, and then when they mature, they begin to wander again, establish new colonies. Now these root forms are really the smallest of all of the cycle. They're somewhat smaller than the actual bugs that you find in the leaf galls. As they reproduce below ground, apparently the conditions are not too favorable, and they don't get as large in body size as the leaf gall forms. Now the root cycle, or the life cycle of the insect on the roots, usually goes through about 6 to 7 generations. Here in California, reports are that about 5 generations occur. The French literature indicates in general about 6 or 7 generations. And these are all derived from parthenogenetic eggs of females. Now, a single female can lay about 200 or 300 eggs, so you can see what can happen. It doesn't really take long for them to produce numbers that do damage and can spread. Now, this cycle is the one that I've given you, except for one final phase, that in September or so, late in the fall, the phylloxera on the roots then begin to move upward toward the soil surface. Some of these form, just simply become crawlers. They crawl along the ground and go down and find other roots. Found new colonies, so it can spread this way, or through cracks in the soil, they can go over to other roots. But under natural conditions, with the American vine, some of these, reaching above ground, develop wings and form the sexual cycle. So then we have, coming from these root forms, the 2 sexual or white fly forms. One is a little larger than the other. The male is small, the female is a little bit larger, but we're only talking about an insect of about 1 millimeter in length, pretty small. And these, of course, then mate and produce, the female then produces the winter egg, which starts a cycle over again. Now, in California, The only part of the cycle that exists is the one below the soil line here. The production of these wing form, the sexual form, does not occur here in California. There have been many ideas expressed as to why they don't form, but presumably it's the very dry air. The insects are very delicate. The wing forms apparently dry out quickly. So the sexual cycle does not occur here in California, fortunately. Where the sexual cycle does occur, it's obviously the principal spread of the insect over long distances, because a female could be carried in the wind for miles and miles, land on new vines, and start up the insect population again. There have been only 2 instances reported of leaf galls being found, and both of these were on vinifera grape, where you wouldn't expect to find them anyway. But even on rootstocks, where they are usually abundant, in other countries we do not have them. For example, Rupestra St. George gets galls very frequently in most countries, but not here in California. So then the sexual cycle does not exist. Hence, the control of the insect and its slow movement have to do here in California with the root form. So hence the spread of the insect here comes mostly from bringing infected roots with the bugs on them into new areas, or sometimes through floodwaters coming through infected vineyards, which will carry the insects down through onto other clean areas. So hence we can do a practice here which cannot be used, for example, in many of the European countries, of establishing vineyards on their own roots, even though they're quite close to phylloxerated areas, phylloxera-infested areas, if we take precautions that the insects are not moved in on the roots or not carted in through infected soil or through floodwaters. Now, an interesting correlation exists between the soil type and phylloxera infestation. It was noted in France that many of the vineyards in sandy soils apparently lived through the phylloxera epidemic. In other words, the phylloxera apparently could not infect vineyards in sandy soils. A good measure of the ability of a soil to resist phylloxera infestation is simply wet the surface. If the soil dries out without making cracks, why then it's a pretty safe soil from the standpoint of phylloxera infestation. If you do get furrows or cracks in the soil after drying, this would indicate that phylloxera could establish itself. Now obviously then in heavy soils which crack badly, for example clay soils, infestation is very rapid and spread is very rapid because of the large furrows or cracks that occur in such heavy soils. Now another method of control is flooding the soil, which has been used to a limited extent, but its importance is decreasing. If, for example, you can keep the surface of the soil flooded for, say, up to 6 weeks, and that means covered over with, say, 4 to 6 inches of water at least, and cover the soil completely, then you kill out most of the phylloxera, not all of it, but most of it. And if this is done periodically every few years, you can maintain fairly good vineyards. However, this practice is only followed in areas where you have a lot of available water during the winter period, along a river or a stream, where you can dam up or pump the water over the vineyard. The vineyard also obviously has to be quite level, because if you leave humps, the air gets in and then you lose the effectiveness of the treatment. So you have to have level vineyards that can be completely submerged, 4 to 6 inches of water, and you'd have to leave it at least 6 weeks And if this is done every few years, you could maintain such a vineyard. Some vineyards are maintained this way in France, along the Rhone River and other rivers. This is possible.
How's that amount of water affect the vine?
Since it's done during the winter period, it does not affect the vine appreciably. The vine is not growing. If you do that when the vine starts growth or after it's growing, that's another matter. Okay, now I'm going to leave the session open for questions. We've got about 5 minutes.
Have they ever done anything about, say, bringing in large loads of sand and mixing it with the soil to try and promote the resistance?
This might be effective if you could get enough sand in, but when you come to moving large quantities of soil, it gets a little expensive.
I don't understand where the male white fly form is coming from. There's only females below the soil.
Well, these females apparently can lay eggs at a certain stage of the season. Perhaps it's a temperature-related condition or something. No one really knows, but these females lay eggs of two kinds at that part of the cycle, one of which develops into a male fly, the other a female.
So all Phylloxera are heterozygous, basically. I mean, there's no opportunity for any crossing of characteristics.
No, I don't think there would be. Yeah, essentially. Well, this sexual cycle here, but they're coming, of course, one has to, would have to know what the distribution, say, of chromosomes were to these eggs. They may be different. No one has really checked that out. In other words, this female may have different potencies in these two types of eggs at that season. At that season.
Do we have the crawling form in California?
This root form is the crawling form. They crawl. Yeah. You weren't in class yesterday, were you? Well, today you should see them crawl. If you dig deep enough and well enough, we'll get some Phylloxera out and you'll see them crawl.
What time of the year do they lay these eggs, either male or female?
In the fall, just about the end of September, October. We can produce these sexual flies in the laboratory. We have done it. Simply, we take roots now and leave them for several weeks. We usually will get a few flies. But that's as far as we go.
Yeah, spread around the state.
No, I don't spread them around the state.
Is the male, if this female produces a male egg, is it on the roots only? Or can it be
No, it would have to be produced. It's produced on the roots, and then they develop wing pads as they move upward. And by the time they get to the surface, they just about have wings grown, completed. And then they take off.
You said that only females are under the soil?
Only females.
Well, the eggs that are laid parthenogenically, why can't she lay a male egg as well as a female?
She does.
She does, and what happens to the males under the soil then?
They go to the surface and become flies.
Well, they either reach the top and get their wings spread, or they die.
Oh, in California, in other words, they die.
Well, we don't know where they die. I can tell you that if you take these bugs from a root, like we're doing now, and put them in the laboratory for a few weeks, you can sometimes get these little white flies. In other words, they do mature the sexual form in the laboratory. I presume the trouble outside is that our atmosphere is too dry, that they perish.
Now, you said that they were forming little wing deals while they were crawling up. Can you find them in the soil in this condition?
I presume you can. If we take a root like we dug yesterday, or some of us dug yesterday, and take that in the laboratory and leave it, you'll see some of these occasionally giving rise to wing pads, and then they'll make a wing form.
Have they tried releasing large amounts of sterilized males in vineyards where there is a sexual form?
Releasing sterilized males? First of all, we don't have any mechanism whereby we could produce any quantity of males or females in the laboratory. It seems to be very difficult. I imagine if the conditions were created, it might be possible. But I think the insect is such a small thing that travels over such a wide area, very difficult to do.
Have they figured out the lifespan of a mature Phylloxera? Is it, say, 2 seasons or 5 years?
Oh no, the actual lifespan of the Phylloxera is some weeks,
So
3 to 4 weeks.
if they ever did find some way of introducing sterile...
Wouldn't be adequate because you got all this material coming up all the time, huh? All the bugs in the ground would be, on the normal conditions on the American vine, they keep reproducing all the time.
I'm talking about the root kind also. Do they live a long time, or
Do they just live for a few weeks and in that time they get worked out?
Oh, they keep reproducing. You get all these cycles, 5, 6 generations at least.